So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Watson Institute. My name is Richard Locke. I'm a professor of political science here at Brown and currently serve as the director of the Watson Institute. And it's wonderful to see you all here on what looks like it's the beginning of a spring day in Providence, and especially to be here for this wonderfully interesting event. For those of you who are new to the Watson Institute, let me just briefly, and I mean briefly, describe what we do and why and how it relates actually to this afternoon's event. So the Watson Institute is Brown University's Center for International and Public Affairs, and our mission is to promote a just and peaceful world through teaching. We are the home of a bunch of teaching programs. Through research, we have several major research programs on development, security, and governance, and through public engagement. And because of our mission, we host hundreds of seminars, workshops, and conferences like the one today every semester. And all of these events, like today's event, seek to both understand as well as to sort of contemplate ways of addressing some of the world's most pressing problems. And it seems to me that the persistent issues, and it's more than one issue, there's a collection of issues. There's some seats over here if you guys want to, and some others in the middle. And that these persistent issues surrounding race, racial relations, racial politics in the United States, including the relationship between the black community and the police, is clearly one of today's most pressing problems in this country, but alas, not just in this country. And that's going to be the focus of this afternoon's event. Now, the panel was provoked by an article that was written by my colleague and friend, Professor Glenn Loury, is a professor of economics and Watson Institute, in the Boston Review. And there are extra copies of the Boston Review floating around if you haven't picked one up already. And the Boston Review is actually a co-sponsor of this event. And in this lead article, Glenn basically questions the wisdom of building a social movement focused on racial justice around the imperfect persona figure of Michael Brown. And he argues against also a series of what he sees as false dichotomies, and for a more objective, maybe dispassionate discussion of the relationship between order and justice, individual and collective responsibility, and a broader, more systemic discussion about what's going on that has led to the kind of criminalization of racial politics and race relations in this country. It's a very, very provocative essay. For those of you who have not had a chance to read the Boston Review, you'll see that it has already provoked all sorts of responses to that article. And today's event is basically going to be more of a discussion and a debate around this essay. And we have three really wonderful panelists who are going to each address Glenn's article. So Glenn is the first person on the panel all the way to the left, and then next to him is Khalil Mohammed, who comes from the Schomberg Center at the New York Public Library. Then we'll have Tricia Rose, who is a professor here at Brown and also the director of the Center for the Study of Race and Ethnicity. And finally, Lisa Miller, who is an associate professor of political science at Rutgers. The structure of the panel is that Glenn will speak for no more than 10 minutes, quickly summarizing the article. Then each of the panelists will respond for no more than 15 minutes. Glenn will have a quick response, and then we'll open it up for discussion and debate. We really do want this to be an open discussion of these issues. And with that, first of all, let me thank you all for participating in this panel and invite Glenn Loury to the podium to begin the presentation. Thanks, Glenn.
Thank you, Rick. Thanks very much. And thanks to Tricia, Khalil, and Lisa for giving up their time to do this forum. I'm flattered at your presence here. Appreciate the opportunity to discuss my piece. Rick said I was seated at the far left of the panel, and that's true. But some might think that I'm not at the far left of the relevant political spectrum on matters of this kind in virtue of the argument that I make in the piece. You all can grab the magazine, and you should spend your precious time tonight reading it carefully. I will not try to summarize what I say in that piece. I do think, though, a few words about what motivated me to write in the way that I did are appropriate here in my now 9 minutes. Mike Brown is no Rosa Parks, and he ain't no Emmett Till either. That would be a very pointed way of putting what I'm getting after there. No Rosa Parks in the sense that, in my opinion, as I try to elaborate in my little piece, this is not the occasion to mount, or not the appropriate occasion upon which to mount, or not the appropriate example or foundation upon which to mount a movement aimed at redressing the problems that are serious and that definitely need to be addressed, and that need to be addressed politically. I don't see us getting there from here. I try to say why in the piece. No Emmett Till either in the following sense. The temptation to draw this analogy, black bodies abused, black lives not mattering throughout American history from the days of slavery through the years and decades of Jim Crow right down into the present day, one seamless elaboration of an ideology of racism and white supremacy that works itself out in the lives of African Americans even as we speak, is a mistaken characterization of the actual circumstance that we confront. Okay? The neoliberal order of the early 21st century, which has human refuse to deal with, black and white human refuse, people without jobs, without the opportunity to develop their God-given talents and to express their full humanity, people who have no futures, who are failed by the schools that serve them, for whom the government has no interest. The talk is all about a middle class and not about the poor. That is not Jim Crow. And the extent to which there is a racial disparity in the suffering that this failure of our political economic order has produced, to the extent that there is a racial disparity, yeah, that is to a great degree a legacy of our racial history. But in my humble opinion, it will not be effectively addressed by characterizing the problem as racism 101, racism American style, and so forth and so on. We need to get down on the ground. On the ground, it's complicated. On the ground, yes, police are running amok. Yes, warrior cops are strutting their stuff up and down American avenues. And they're picking out black people, and they're picking on black people. And it's a crime, it's a shame, it's against their constitutional rights, our constitutional rights, and it should be protested. But it's not going to solve the problem of the failed schools. It's not going to solve the problem of an economy that has no place for anybody. It's not going to solve the problem of urban space that's organized in a racially segregated way because it suits the interest of the people with power who live in these places. If we want to remove the structural impediments to the full expression of African American humanity, we need a broad-based, non-racial political movement that aims at the foundations of our political economy. That's the position that I've taken. So this is not the movement that's going to get that done. He's no Rosa Parks. He's no Emmett Till either. The depredations of racist police officers in American cities, such as they are, comes nowhere close to being state-sanctioned violence of the kind that you saw throughout this country not that long ago. It is a disservice and to some degree a disrespect, I'm maintaining, of that legacy now overcome of state-sanctioned violence, such as one saw elaborated at Bloody Sunday on Edmund Pettus Bridge back in Selma, Alabama in 1965. It is to some degree a disrespect of that tradition to latch onto, if you will, even to cherry pick a relatively few cases. They are egregious and they should be objected to, and then characterize that as playing out in the 21st century what we've always known, black bodies don't matter and so forth and so on. I get why that works with sophomores. I don't get why it works with serious people. Thank you.
Our next speaker, Khalil.
Go get him, Khalil.
Wow. Gee whiz. sophomores and serious people. What a segue. Well, first, let me say thank you to Glenn for being who he is, for being provocative, for being smart, for providing context for debate, because they are healthy. They help us get to our assumptions. I want to thank my fellow panelists. I think we're all reeling a little bit. And I want to thank all of you for being part of this event and this conversation. So I think that Glenn's being a little squirrely here because his point of view is not quite as pointed in either the piece or the reply, though they do share some things in common. So it's I'm sort of wrestling with what I read and what I just heard. Let me also say that, and I do have a timer here, so I'm going to stick to my 15 minutes. Let me also say that as a historian, I do want to address how history matters in this formulation, certainly the one that Glenn just characterized. So I'm going to do a little bit of back and forth between what we just heard and what I prepared to remark upon. Let me first concede a few things that I think Glenn does very well in the written piece, in the ways in which he attempts to capture the nuance of the moment, which I do think is what troubles him. And I think he's troubled. I think both in his presentation just now and his sort of taking his seat. And I'm trying to deal with that because I think part of what we're wrestling with here is the softness and the squishiness, the messiness of our own emotional responses to these. It's not just the facts on the ground. It's not just what we can look up in Bureau of Justice statistics and have a debate about how many black people killed each other and what is the frame and the context for this premature death that I know that Glenn is troubled by. It's also what is our proximity to it? Bryan Stevenson, as some of you know, has been fighting for those sentenced to the death penalty across this country, but particularly in the South, through the Equal Justice Initiative, and has just written a memoir called Just Mercy. And I want to evoke him because he is fundamentally committed to this idea of proximity, this idea that proximity is critical to us changing the very world that Glenn, I think, aptly described. I think I completely agree with his characterization of the range of problems, both rooted in our economy and our political ideology, and the way that we treat one another, and the willingness to endure the suffering of others without care or concern. I agree with Glenn on that. And I think Bryan Stevenson is trying to push us into a space that is precisely an emotional one, that it is through proximity to that suffering, that it is in knowing people who are on death row, in representing them, and getting to know their families, that we might fundamentally reorient and change our relationship to them and our relationship to the problem. And so I think Glenn is forcing us to get closer to this in the way in which he's forced us into this room right now. I do, therefore, want to read one quote from his that I think articulates the best of his thinking around this and the way in which he is straddling a very fine line as both a chronicler of our moment, a provocateur, and someone offering prescriptive claims for how we might see our way through this. So here I quote, "Hence, law enforcement personnel working in these neighborhoods are responsible for treating everyone they encounter with dignity and respect, regardless of their race, age, gender, demeanor, and economic status. Indeed, the police are servants of all the people, even the ones who don't speak particularly good English, who haven't had a job in 3 years, who hang out in front of a store with 40-ounce beverages in a brown paper bag, who can be found in the alleyway smoking a joint, who have just come home from a 3-year stint upstate. That is the job they, the police, signed up for. If we all stated from the premise that cops are essential and that cops are responsible for the safety and respectful treatment of everybody, we would be in a much better place. These communities need the police to defend them from criminal victimization." And I think he's exactly right in his call for dignity and respect, for recognizing that one's humanity cannot be diminished by a single act on a given day, whether good or evil, and that our police officers should not be empowered to make presumptive judgments about the humanity of an individual, which I do think at its core is what broken windows policing is about and what stop and frisk policing is about, which we can talk about in the context of debate or discussion. That those are, we have mobilized our resources to make presumptive judgments about people, regardless of their individual behavior. But Glenn's not evoking that right here. He's evoking a standard of dignity and respect that I do not think reflects policing that happens in most communities if we listen to the people who live in those communities, the people who are not Mike Brown, the people who are elderly residents of those communities, the people who are 12-year-olds, like so many in New York City subject to stop and frisk practices just on their way to and from school. If we listen to those people, if we are proximate to those people, we understand that they are asking for dignity and respect and that their innocence be protected. Okay. So I love this statement. I love its nuance, its respect for all parties, and its description of a kind of ethical ecology. But it is incomplete. It retreats to a narrow view of police power and criminal justice as the core issue. And Glenn here articulates this point himself. The controversy over the shooting in Ferguson, he writes, underscores the fact that the main source of racial tensions in modern America is the tortured relationship between residents of urban black communities and the police there. So I have 5 claims in reference to this point. First, that it is the leadership and not the officer that is the problem. That may be a small issue, but I think it is a large point in this controversy. Second, the leadership are not accountable to the communities that they police. William Stuntz, the late legal scholar who Glenn himself turned me on to, made this point in his book, The Collapse of the American Criminal Justice System. And there are a number of other scholars who are wrestling with the legacy of federalism, including Naomi Murakawa in her recent work, which starts in the context of a liberal effort to expand civil rights, to see racial violence itself as evidence of an unwieldy system that is capricious, and that proceduralism would solve the way towards ending racial violence. In other words, both the impact of federalism as well as the ongoing challenges of electoral politics for minority populations, particularly African Americans, means that they are not controlling the apparatus of justice in their community. They do not have the means of politics or electoral power to define the quality of justice in their community. I think that is an important distinction that lives beyond the beat cop or what the officer is doing or what's inside his head or inside of his or her heart. Third, would anyone argue that policing is the primary instrument of public order, of public safety in middle-class and affluent white communities? Let me repeat the question. Would anyone here argue that policing is the primary instrument of public order or of public safety in middle-class and affluent white communities? Ask yourselves. Are the police, or is the culture of economics in those communities what makes them work? Let me be more specific. Let's look a little closer. Policing in most of these communities is low intensity and it is individualized. The culture of these communities is premised on an assumption of respectability. I would even argue a mythology of respectability, a kind of meta-narrative that everyone who lives in these communities are morally upstanding individuals, regardless of what happens behind closed doors, as indicated perhaps by self-reporting of drug use that exists within those communities, or the widespread problem of domestic violence in those communities. So if we just take 2 ends of the spectrum that defined much of what shapes our criminal justice system, drug use on one hand and violence on another, one might argue that there is a kind of mythology of respectability that also shapes the public order of those communities. Those communities are assumed to be dignified and respectful, which I think has nothing to do with the police and everything to do with the narrative of those communities. These are also communities that drive what some would argue, particularly in evangelical circles, an American culture that is misogynistic, hedonistic, and materialistic. Were it not for affluent and middle-class white communities, would that we have the kind of media industries and political culture that we have? And I cite here only that Empire. One expression of this is making critical rave and breaking through all of the Nielsen ratings precisely because Middle-class white men and women are tuning in record numbers. So where do we begin to make certain claims about what public order looks like outside of black communities, where I would suggest that policing has very little to do with it? Fourth, and this is a corollary of the second point about leadership, and that is that those communities have a disproportionate political influence on the shape of policies and the politicians who legislate and enforce the laws. What do I mean by that? In these communities where African Americans cannot vote, they also cannot shape how politicians at the state level both construct laws or how they are enforced. So it's not simply that the mayor and the police commissioner, for example, are less accountable to the people who are subject to these policies. It's also that there is a hard truth about the way that state governments work in this country, and is the basis of laws that literally define much of the criminal justice system in our country. And I think we have to keep our eye on the relationship of what the people in the community for whom we are here talking about and their access to the levers of power in politics. And finally, the fifth is the cost of bad policing and mass incarceration show the willingness to use taxpayer dollars to enforce racial subordination. The main source of the problem is not policing. It is symptomatic of racial subordination, which undergirds capitalism. Let me elaborate one step further. We continue to hear new reports in our media cycle about how much city governments are spending to settle lawsuits related to abusive policing. We also know that estimates run for incarcerating individuals from 40 to 60,000 annually. We also know this is contributing to some of those who are on the right and very much interested in decriminalization and rolling back our high rates of mass incarceration, which is to say, ultimately, that policing is symptomatic of a choice that we make to subordinate people, even at the high cost that we pay. So the economics of this, coming back to Glenn's original proposition, is not collateral consequence of a set of bad decisions. We are choosing to put our resources in a set of policies that subordinate African Americans, where policing is just simply one echo of those sets of choices. Danielle Allen, who is one of the respondents, agrees in this case, and I'll cite her, and I know I've got 2.5 minutes. Our problem is not exclusion to be solved by inclusion. Our problem is domination to be solved by non-domination, that we must reconstitute our social order. In my remaining time, then let me come back to what I think is the most provocative claim that Glenn makes today in relationship to the piece that we read, that Mike Brown ain't no Emmett Till or no Rosa Parks. Seems to me that Glenn partly misses the point of history. Not only that history is imprecise and subject to revision and renewed interpretation, that history is often in the service of the present, whether we want to admit it or not, whether as professional historians or those who use history in our work. That's one claim. Glenn would want us to hold on to a much more static notion of what the past teaches us in this moment, and we can debate that. But the other, it seems to me, that part of what we learn from the era that produced Rosa Parks and Emmett Till, that the reason why the legacy of that moment should be an evolving way in which we understand the moment is precisely because I would argue that the failure of our historical memory is our failure to appreciate that the civil rights movement did not, in fact, make criminal justice reform central to its work. That, in fact, one could argue that he's exactly right. Mike Brown is no Rosa Parks, nor is an Emmett Till, and shouldn't be. Because if he were to evoke the respectability claim or the innocence claim, if he were to fit the model that Glenn, I think, has upheld as an example that we should reject, then we might find ourselves falling, or we might find ourselves fighting for scraps at the assimilation table rather than a fundamental reorientation of, as Glenn suggests, our social structure. So we don't want Michael Brown to be a Rosa Parks or an Emmett Till. And maybe as a rallying point for the circumstances of today, thinking here of a Richard Wright, left of the civil rights movement at the time, evoking a bigger Thomas as evidence of the damage of capitalism in this world, a very ugly and dystopic and sinister view of even black humanity, stripped of its moral agency and individual will, which troubles Glenn in this formulation, nevertheless might be a mythic figure to meet the challenges of this moment. I will reserve the balance of my time in Q&A to talk about whether or not we should strip our progressive reform agenda, if in fact there is one here that we might agree upon, of its racial valence. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Rick. Thank the Watson Institute, and thank my colleagues near and far. I have to beg to differ, honestly, with both presentations. So we'll just keep it as sharp as I can, because I have a lot to say. Let me look now before I go into a haze of argument and lose track of time. First, I'm profoundly disturbed by the facile use of Rosa Parks and Emmett Till in a context in which we're expected to feel comfortable judging the fundamental character and morality of individuals as the basis upon which we should then choose to develop a movement for social justice. It's a ridiculous idea that people have had to make political calculations to do. Rosa Parks was chosen over other young women who were going to take her place because they became pregnant. There were 2 actual women in that situation, and that it was feared that a young woman with a baby couldn't stand the scrutiny of the moral exceptionalism that black people are forced to live up to, that everyone else escapes. And that they had to find the perfect woman, the perfect black person, the wonderful individual who does nothing wrong, who doesn't erupt in rage at systemic racism, that doesn't do anything terrible, so that we can prove to white people that structural racism is happening. Can somebody explain to me how insane that is? Now, does that mean I think I should want to defend Mike Brown's possible stealing of a cigar? No, but I can describe my Dalton prep school experience with white children and the criminal activities they engaged in all the time, that not only went unmarked, but if it got marked, imagine how many exceptional explanations. Oh, you know, his dad's never around. He's traveling off, you know, in the bowels of capitalism. He just doesn't have time to raise him properly. And what did we get? Yeah, he needs help. He needs assistance. He needs some care and love. Put the cigars back, John. Come on, John. But when it's Mike, he becomes the proverbial thug. Now, let me engage with the theoretical framework of the piece, because the piece itself, I think, does something much more pernicious than is available on the surface. The written piece sets up 3 central oppositions, 3 central extreme oppositions. They are individual versus community responsibility, pigs versus thugs, and gentle giant versus public menace. And these 3 strategies, these three oppositions frame the ideological logic of the piece. And I want to back us up from this and ask, who frames stories this way and why? And I want to make an argument that the use of this and one other strategy that I'm going to unpack in a moment mirror corporate media's way of framing arguments to produce extreme oppositional thinking, absolutism, and a kind of sense that these kinds of claims are fundamentally both equally irrational, and the truth lies at some fictitious middle. And why that matters so much is because in that middle is status quo. In that middle is the life we're leading right now, a life structured in extraordinary structural violence against black people. It is by no means a seamless elaboration of history. It is actually a very complex, transforming kind of elaboration. That is to say, it's very different now than it was. And Jim Crow was not a national phenomenon. It was a regional phenomenon. But slavery was also a regional phenomenon with national consequences. We have many different formations over the past 350 years. It's not seamless. But if we do not attend to the very clear ways in which the elaboration retains a fundamental set of principles, then we get lost. So let me give you a clear example of how this is not Jim Crow. During Jim Crow, you had explicit laws that were intentionally designed to language black people as non-human, less than human, less valuable, less important structurally, and not able to access citizenship and any equal rights. It was very clear, it was very explicit. But that was a mechanism for something bigger. And this is where the continuity remains. That was a mechanism for what would then have been called white power or white supremacy in that context, which is the control of resources, the control of space, and the creation of a social world based on race and racial privilege. So the question is, well, how do you get to that kind of outcome after the civil rights movement? You want to create that outcome? You can't create laws that say black people can't vote, black people can't have the same resources in school, black people can't fill in the blank. You create structural racism, a language of race-neutral language, laws that produce economically almost the same effects, socially very similar effects. Yes, we have a larger middle class. I can hear Glenn. Yes, we have a larger middle class, but we have a much more isolated, controlled, and desperate black working class and poor that is not just the product of poverty, but the product of structural racism in relationship to the evisceration of resources in black communities. So it's not just poverty in the abstract. It's why you see very different formations of community among black poor and other groups of people who are poor. So structural racism, for those who don't follow this field at all, the very simple definition is the normalized, that's very important because it's not exceptional, it's normalized, and legitimized range of policies, practices, and attitudes. So it's belief, policy, and practices that routinely, not exceptionally, produce cumulative and chronic adverse outcomes for people of color, especially black people, and it's the main driver of racial inequality and racial discrimination in America today. So this extremist speech that the media uses to create this oppositional language of individual versus community, pigs versus thugs, gentle giant versus public menace, obscures structural racism entirely. It forces our attention to imagine that Darren Wilson has to be either a pig or a great cop, or Mike Brown has to be a thug or a complete perfect victim. The media is deeply invested in these fictions because they obscure the structural forces that are at play. We don't need to talk about Mike Brown on his own. We could very easily talk about the hundreds of cases and all of those who have not been killed, but simply harassed. The statistics that New York City has elaborated, and has offered around stop and frisk suggest that all young black and Latino men in New York have been stopped at least 2 to 3 times. In order for the numbers of stops and frisks for that age and race group to be true, people would have had to have been multiply stopped and frisked. This is rendered invisible by pig and thug. This is rendered invisible by individual versus personal responsibility for behavior. This is obscured by gentle giant versus public menace. So these trio of extremist positions about crime, about punishment, about character, about responsibility, in this framework, they stand outside of history, power, and ideology. They, in fact, stand outside of the context that create the very categories themselves. Thugs are not race-neutral figures. Thugs are a racial dog whistle. That is the purpose of the term, to use it as a neutral, oppositional phrase that is not designed actually to dehumanize a constituency who has long been dehumanized, is, it seems to me, historically inaccurate and politically a little bit dishonest. The second media strategy is the disaggregation of the story. So what does the media do? Whenever these cases happen, we go deep down into what kind of person, what was he doing, what was she doing, where were they? We get all involved in what I call the patent place of false, news reporting. We get immediately, over and over, despite the continuities of circumstances, despite the evidence that explains structurally what has happened in not just policing, but in all of the facets of structural racism, we somehow can't tell that story. We can't tell the story of how housing, criminal justice, joblessness, underemployment, incredible, staggering wealth gap based on race, incredibly troubled schools work in concert with one another to produce an interlocking system that renders working class, not just extremely poor, but working class and poor black people as a whole, despite exceptions, absolutely, uniquely, and specifically destroyed as a community. That is not a question on the table, as far as I'm concerned. There's enormous, elaborate evidence for this. But what becomes visible with disaggregation? Did Mike Brown try to steal a cigar? Was Darren Wilson legitimate in shooting him however many times? You know, is it good to sell Lucy's? You know, breaking the law is a bad thing. We end up in a ridiculous conversation about Lucy's. That is a reference not to Mike Brown, but to Eric Garner and the case of his situation in Staten Island. So this kind of disaggregation of the story into a microfocus personalizes systemic forces. It robs us of our intelligence. It asks us to equate our comfort zone with a racial justice project. And it actually suggests that if you're comfortable, you should be comfortable. Because these are just the details of exceptionalism. These are the details that allow us to remain reasonable from a comfortable place, not outraged, not despairing, not with an extreme level of emotional empathy, and not with a recognition that, you know what, we did not actually fundamentally transform the racial relationships and dynamics in this country. We transformed the mechanisms through which certain structures continue to operate. And so I would like to say in conclusion, there is absolutely no disagreement on the question of getting on the ground. It's the one phrase. I will end on a brief moment of agreement. Yes, we need to get on the ground. And what that ground is outside of media narrative. It means talking to organizers, knowing that Mike Brown is not the linchpin to a movement. He's one spark among many. And anybody involved in the criminal justice activism, which I'm sure Glenn Loughton knows quite a bit about, would know that he's one of hundreds and hundreds of people and many, many local movements all over the ground, multiracial, inflected by race, not limited to the category of race, but transforming the identity of whiteness so that a social justice movement is not a project of racial polarization. Thank you.
Hi, thank you. Get my timer here as well, since my colleagues did such an excellent job of keeping to their time. Thank you very much to the Watson Institute, and especially to Glenn for inviting me. This is really a pleasure. And very much thanks to my colleagues for being here. It's just an honor to be on this panel with them. I have a little bit of data I want to show you. And so if I can find the slideshow button. There we go. I'm a political scientist. We like charts and figures. We learned that from economists, actually. And so I just want to show you a few things that I think will highlight, I hope, and explain my reactions to Glenn's piece. And let me first say that I very much agree with one particular aspect of Glenn's argument. And that is that the fixation on policing is deeply misguided. That is not to say that the protests against policing were incorrect or wrong in some way, but that organizing and ordering a social justice movement around the policing problem, or even for that matter, mass incarceration, I think is unlikely to have the kinds of outcomes that those of us who care about these issues are interested in. And so I very much agree that this focus on police and sort of the non-recognition of problems of order and violence in amongst African Americans and within African American communities is problematic. On the other hand, I very much agree with my colleagues that I'm troubled by the way race and sort of the history of racial hierarchy and the persistence of white supremacy in the United States drops out, or seems to me anyway to drop out of the spirit of Glenn's argument. And I'm also worried about the discussions of character and responsibility in the context of what I call racialized state failure in American politics. And what I'd like to do is offer maybe a kind of a broader lens for the discussion that might, I hope, provide some firmer ground for the kinds of broader scope that that I think Glenn really aims to get at, and that my colleagues certainly raised in their comments. And this broader frame is what I refer to as racialized state failure. And I see it as a way of drawing together some very serious, long-standing failures of the American state to make good on the democratic promise and the promise of prosperity for African Americans. And I want to focus on just two aspects of state failure, which are the main aspects of state failure, which have to do with security from violence and security from the state violence, that is. And so I just want to show you a couple images and a couple of charts and try to make sense out of this for you. And my slides here are, I've done the cardinal sin of PowerPoint, which is probably to have some text on slides, too much text on a slide. But it's as much to focus myself as you, because the argument's a little bit complicated, so I hope I can make sense of it for you here today. I worry a little bit to some extent that Glenn's piece falls into a narrative that bifurcates or sort of dichotomizes things a bit in the way Tricia explained. One is the thing that we heard a lot from conservative talk shows, which is the redirection of public discourse to black-on-black crime, right? So you get these media images and conservative talk show, radio talk show, and television talk show hosts saying, everyone's talking about policing, but really let's talk about the real problem of black victimization, which is coming from other blacks. And then even some African-American groups focus on this as well. I was at a Martin Luther King Day event in Newark, New Jersey, in Wickwak High School. You can probably pronounce that for me. Weequahic, thank you. Which is an African-American, largely, almost exclusively African-American high school, where all the talk was on stopping so-called black-on-black crime. And the racial liberal, or sort of the racial progressive response to this typically is to highlight the fact that black-on-black crime is a nonsensical term when you consider the fact that virtually all crime is intra-racial, right? People tend to commit crime against people of the same racial group. But in doing so, racial liberals tend to want to bracket the crime conversation away from the policing conversation. And this is something that I do think Glenn doesn't want to do, and I agree with him. And I think doing that, I think bracketing the police violence conversation from what I call the street violence conversation is a mistake. And I think it's a mistake for a number of reasons. First, it reinforces the idea that the primary tool for ameliorating racial inequality on justice issues is to further constrain the state, to further rein in the state from its abusive practices. But in doing that, we obscure the larger causes of racial equality, which I think Tricia very much alluded to, which have to do with the failure of the state to act affirmatively to successfully protect African Americans to the same degree as white Americans from early death. So understanding the link between the disproportionate exposure of African Americans to state violence and to murder reveals a far more tragic reality than I think the singular focus on policing suggests. And I read Glenn to be trying to draw in these other realities. And I refer to this as the racialized failure of the American state. Now, my colleagues in comparative politics would object to this term. State failure is a term we apply to undeveloped countries, not rich democracies like the United States. But what I want to say is that a lot of what my colleagues are describing is really the lack of involvement of a state in the African American community, with the exception of policing and prisons. And that the response to the vast array of disparities and inequalities that have been produced and reproduced by the American state for African Americans are responded to with a kind of muscular criminal justice state at the expense of this wide range of other state options that have been available to white Americans. So how serious is this state failure? Well, let me just give you a couple of slides. Many of you are probably familiar with this slide, which is imprisonment rates. The United States, way above everybody else by far, not even close. It's off the charts, right beyond the pale, multiple times higher than our democratic cousins in Europe. I've just put a few on here. We're familiar probably with some of the work by Bruce Western on lifetime risk of imprisonment, right? And we certainly know that African Americans, especially males, are dramatically more likely to experience imprisonment than white Americans. What we're less familiar with is homicide rates, and the deep exposure of African Americans to violent victimization that white Americans are by far more insulated from. So this is just an overall graph, but what I want to just call your attention to is to notice that in the United States, the lowest violence years are higher than the highest violence years of the next most violent country of rich democracies, which is Canada. So our lowest homicide rates are about 4 per 100,000. Canada's peak homicide rates were 3 per 100,000. So we are off the charts with respect to lethal violence. Now, not surprisingly, we're off the charts with respect to lethal violence generally, but particularly when it comes to African Americans. Now, this is race and gender, homicide rates by race and gender. And what you see is a shocking and horrifying exposure of lethal violence, of African American males to lethal violence that dwarfs every other race-gender combination. Moreover, if you look carefully, you also see that African American females, which is this line, are victimized by murder at a rate higher than white males, which is quite extraordinary when you look at homicide data around the globe. Homicide is by and large a male-on-male phenomenon. And it is remarkable that the exposure of African American women to homicide goes largely unremarked upon. And it's one of the reasons why I object to the fixation on policing and imprisonment, because it leaves us with this gendered account of racial inequality, because it talks about the effect of all of these institutions on African American males and neglects the deep suffering of African American women. But notice the African American male rates, which are extraordinarily high, and at their worst, approach homicide rates in some of the more violent countries in the world. So places where we are cognizant of people being unsafe. That's the kind of exposure that African American males experience in the United States. And if we look at this in a different way, and I want to actually, let me just do this before I detail it a little bit more. Understanding homicide risk by rate per 100,000 is quite difficult because nobody knows 100,000 people. But if we think about life risk, and this is a very kind of heuristic, it's not a great tool because it holds constant homicide rates, which of course you can see fluctuate a great deal. But just to give you an idea of how serious this problem is, if you take a homicide rate at a given year, and you imagine somebody living a 75-year lifetime with that level of homicide, what lifetime risk does is calculate the odds of being a victim of murder. And if we look again at the gender race differences, you are not misreading, it's not a typo. At the height of the violent crime wave in the United States, if you were born in 1980 or 1994 as an African American male, and the homicide rate had remained that high for your entire lifetime, 1 in 20 African American males, could expect to be murdered, which is a stunning and remarkable and tragic statistic. We also see African American females, as you noted before, a much higher risk than white males, and white females whose life risk of homicide, even at their peak, come much closer to the kinds of European protection from homicide that we're used to hearing about in the news, right? The sort of halcyon Scandinavian countries where nobody ever killed anybody. They're still higher, by the way. American homicide rates are higher than European homicide rates, even when you remove the exceptionally high rates for African Americans. And I just have one last thing down here because, again, it just shows you the shocking reality here. If you took an African American male in 1994 between 18 and 24, and if you somehow magically stayed 18 and 20 to 24 for your whole life, which would be a tragedy itself, and lived your whole life with the risk of homicide at that age, because that was the single highest homicide rate and the single most victimized demographic group, your life risk of homicide would be 1 in 8. 1 in 8. So when we think about policing, you can begin to see why I want to talk about something so much broader. And as I say, I read Glenn to be wanting to do that as well, and I hope that this is offering us some kind of framework. So what I refer to as racialized state failure has to do with the risk of violence as a first-order political problem, no matter the source, whether the source is from other people, whether the source is from the state, whether the source is from one's racial group or another racial group. And I can tell you of 20 years of working in the politics of crime and justice, all citizens have the expectation that the state will ameliorate these risks. All citizens, regardless of race or class, and as was highlighted so nicely earlier, the expectation that middle-class white Americans have is certainly that if there's a risk, they will be protected by the state in one way or another. And if the laws don't protect them sufficiently, they will have the laws changed. So all citizens expect the state to do something about violence. It's the core state obligation and the essence of statehood, the hallmark of the modern state. Unfortunately, this fixation on state violence, as I say, I think obscures this vastly greater risk of early death for African Americans from a wide range of sources. And I don't have time to go into more detail, but we could look at many, many social risks, from unemployment to injury to infant mortality to health to just about every social risk you can imagine. Social risks which, by the way, modern democracies have managed to insulate many of their citizens from. And white Americans enjoy much of that insulation as well from those risks, and African Americans do not. And I'm running out of time, so let me see. I have 2 minutes. So I guess I will jump to my conclusion, which is that I take Glenn to be saying that, of course, limited and fair application of the use of force by police is a crucial component of the democratic state. But by focusing only on that dimension of the state, we miss the larger role that the state plays in insulating the polity from risk. If African Americans constituted a distinct nation, the economic, social, and political conditions in which many live would be characterized as evidence of an ineffective state, one that leaves its citizens unnecessarily exposed to the kinds of risks that modern democratic states have very effectively reduced. So I would like to invoke the Black Lives Matter phrase, Glenn, but Black Lives Matter, I guess I want to conclude, and the American state has failed and continues to fail to offer the same security of modern statehood for African Americans that white Americans enjoy. Thank you very much.
Let me reply briefly. Obviously, I'm not going to be able to rebut the criticism that Tricia has passionately and brilliantly offered in the few moments that I have here. I would like to try to defend myself a bit against a couple of her charges, though. I'm not practicing any kind of politics of respectability when I say Mike Brown is no Rosa Parks. When I say that, I'm saying that the opportunity to mount a movement to actually change the things that we believe are wrong with the structure of our political economy is not well served by Mike Brown's example, and I stand by that. This is not about whether he was squeaky clean. This is not about whether he was a nice guy, whether he was pregnant or got somebody pregnant. This is about what actually happened on that street in Ferguson, Missouri, in August of 2014. And the facts, I have to insist, do matter. We can't imagine the facts to be what we might like them to be in order to serve a narrative or a larger political agenda that we might have. Mike Brown was not murdered on that street. He was not shot by some racist cop who was on a hunt to kill black people. One could even raise a question as to whether or not his death is a racial injustice. Certainly his death is at some level an injustice. It's certainly a tragedy. One could even question whether or not it's a racial injustice. I don't think that case, Michael Brown's case, has much at all to do with Tamir Rice, the 12-year-old who was shot in a park in Cleveland, or with Eric Garner, the gentleman selling Lucy cigarettes out in front of a convenience store in Staten Island. I don't see that those cases are manifestations of the same general social tendency of structural racism. It strikes me that these cases stand or fall on their own. And in the case of Ferguson, Missouri, as the Department of Justice has recently reported, the facts don't bear out what the narrative, what we would have wanted the narrative to be. One more point in just this brief response to Tricia's criticism. No, I didn't write the piece that you would have written, or perhaps that you would have had me write. No, I didn't take the opportunity in the Boston Review to mount a full-throated frontal assault on structural racism. I was addressing myself, and I said so, to the question of what we're going to do with the fact of what happened to Michael Brown as people were going around the country trying to mount a movement. And I had my questions, my doubts about the wisdom of that. I still do. The oppositions that I set out were not meant to be a media strategy to obscure the truth and prevent us from getting at the root of what was going on. They were a rhetorical strategy, I will grant you that, but that nowhere in that piece do I try to claim there's a happy medium in between the two. In fact, my whole point is viewing the world through this kind of Manichaean black and white oppositional lens is itself not productive to getting at the complexity of the social reality that we're confronting. Khalil says that I don't get quite how people use history. I don't get the idea that history is told and retold from generation to generation, and that the narratives that come out of our historical experience can be put into the service of contemporary problems far different from those that that may have given rise to the historical fact in the first place. And it's true that I am not comfortable with the appropriation of the civil rights movement's moral capital on behalf of the Michael Browns of this world, if you'll let me put it like that. It's true that I'm not comfortable with where the contemporary leadership and spokespersons for this inheritance of the moral capital of the civil rights movement, with what they're doing with it. No, I'm not very happy to see the likes of Al Sharpton at the helm of anything. I am not at all happy with the what I take to be sophomoric, and I insist, it's not deep social analysis, equation of what might have been the character of racial domination in American society in 1920 with the nature of the marginalization of populations of color, amongst others, in 2015. I'm not at all comfortable with it. It doesn't look to me to be sufficiently deep and sophisticated thinking. Tell me where I'm wrong. Finally, I want to say this, and this is in the spirit of what Lisa Miller has offered. So I'm about to say something that Rudy Giuliani agrees with. Okay? I'm going to count the number of homicide cases in New York City in the year 2014. I'm going to compare it to the number of homicide cases in New York City in the year 1994. Okay? We're down by nearly an order of magnitude, from over 2,000 to under 400. Okay? 2/3, roughly, of the victims of homicide in New York City are going to be African American and Latino men, mostly young. So we're talking many, many hundreds of African American lives, black lives, that have not been extirpated because of what is different in New York City in 2015 relative to 1994. Is that stop and frisk policing? Frankly, I don't know, and I know of no evidence to say that stop and frisk policing has produced this result, and I'm not advocating stop and frisk or zero tolerance or broken window policing here. I'm not. I'm simply observing that a sea change in the character of black life in the city has taken place. Do the police have something to do with this? Almost certainly yes. Almost certainly yes. Are the police in New York City the enemy of young black men? Why should we construct them as implacably the enemy of those whose lives they may have saved? So I'll end with that.
Okay, and I'm sure that other panelists have lots to say, but let's open it up for question and answers and discussion, and I'm sure the panelists will, while they're responding to one of your questions, respond to Glenn as well. So who has comments, questions, and if you could please identify yourself. Yes.
Thank you all for, the very, very...
You could identify yourself, Patricia.
I'm Patricia because I'm a postdoc here at Watson. I find this very fascinating and interesting. I know this debate has been going on for a very long time. And what I find out, what I notice from everybody is this one thing, even Glenn, which is conservative analysis of the whole issue, is that the problem is highly structural. It's a structural problem. I think everyone on this planet agrees with that. There is a problem, and that problem is structural. So what I want to understand, one is this, I want all of you to probably, if you could could answer it is what should be the solution to this problem? If you all agree that there is a problem. Then secondly, I would like Glenn to probably elaborate more in when he says that this problem should be taken in a neutral, race neutral way and more broad. I would like to know if you could elaborate this more, because if you say it's race neutral and you admit there is a racial problem, how do we address this in a race neutral way? Thank you.
Great.
Should I respond?
Yeah.
Let me just try to answer the second one first, and it ties into something that Tricia said in her remarks, which is about understanding structural racism as distinct from the sort of historical overt racism that everybody says, oh, we're a colorblind society now, and so forth and so on. I don't maintain that in a rich socio-historical analysis of the situation, one can escape the role that race has played, is playing in producing and reproducing the structures that we object to. But I think that if we want to be successful politically, we need allies and we need a broad-based movement. Tricia observed accurately that much of the agitation and the sort of upswell of energy and the participatory involvement in protest and so on and struggle is multiracial. That's true. I think we need a lot more of that, and I think ultimately we're going to have to frame the claims in ways that are broader than race. I could be wrong about that. It's not a principled stand. It's not a stand that says we have to be colorblind because that's the right way of doing it or something like that. It's a pragmatic judgment about how do you get 51% to do something. I want to know what changes we want to have, and I want to know how they're going to happen. For example, and I'll stop. They don't do stop and frisk policing like they used to do in New York City. Okay? That's not because the police commissioner suddenly had a moral conversion and is no longer a racist. It's because there was an election in that city, and the people of that city voted in majority to put someone in power. It was always Michael Bloomberg. It was never Ray Kelly. It wasn't Ray Kelly's fault that they were doing stop and frisk policing. He worked at the pleasure of and implemented the policies of Michael Bloomberg, who was elected 3 times by Democratic majorities in the city. Elect somebody who has a different view about how to handle these problems. That's a step forward towards solving these problems. How do you do that? You need 51%.
Sure. How about others who want to address the question or other things? I can see some.
I don't know where to begin, so I'd be here for a long time, so I defer.
Well, we got time.
Yeah, just begin.
Goodness. Well, I'll start at the end. Stop and frisk did not end because people elected a new mayor, Glenn. It stopped because people organized and it was declared unconstitutional. Activism, strategic, constant, extreme activism against the normalized logic of the state operating on behalf of white supremacy was challenged by many people of different groups who are anti-racist no matter their racial background. Racial comedy, racial collaboration, multiracial societies survive if they are anti-racist, if they're democratic and anti-racist. It's not about, being multiracial and colorblind. It's about transforming what it means to understand race in American society. That requires an ideological examination that's very significant. I'm a little bit confused though, Glenn, why you would go back to this illusion that Mike Brown is the groundswell of a movement. People have been talking about this for 2 years straight, protesting for 2 years straight. I mean, just the last 5 cases alone have enough continuity for people to be on a national level of constant activism and movement. So it's not to say that Mike Brown needs, that you're making an argument for respectability politics. It's to say that Mike Brown is one example of many. But I would still submit that the reason the police stopped them walking across the street had everything to do with the perception of a black male teenager who needed to be harassed. The Ferguson Police Department and the Ferguson municipality is the least strategically, structurally racist municipality in a surrounding municipal area. It's the good news. when you connect it to what municipalities are doing to crush through fines, through policing, through treatment, Mike Brown is what you call a tip of an iceberg. He's a catalyst, a tipping point. He needn't be, someone who Darren Wilson had a good reason to shoot or not for the case to be made. In other words, the drill down into the illusion of the disaggregation creates the illusion that once we know Michael Brown's character or his behavior or his criminal activity, then we know something about crime, race, and structural racism. We don't. That's the point. And so in no way am I saying he should be charging cops or not charging cops. But I know that when Darren Wilson evoked the language of him as a demon, no matter how well trained he is as a cop, and when he said he felt like a kindergartner, he invoked what all implicit bias, as well as historians, your terrific work and others have argued, is a whole history of racial unconscious, a terrible fear of black men that whites and blacks, but way more significantly among whites, drives policy, behavior, attitude, and interaction. It simply cannot be underestimated as a force. So, it seems to me that, that has to be confronted. I just have one last thing to say. The title of the piece is Ferguson Won't Change Anything, What Will? And I would just submit that I don't really hear you trying to tell us what will, except bring back the civil rights movement. And my answer to that is, okay, what will is almost a rhetorical question here, an almost anti-movement question, which I know you couldn't mean. So I would love, after we hear from other people, to hear you tell me what you think will do it. Let's just say Mike Brown never happened. Let's just say some kid say we go to Tamir Rice instead, since you thought that was a legitimate case. Why not, in fact, say, let's use him and then do what? I would love to hear what the doing what would look like for you in this context.
I'd like to know what you think what we should do.
You know what, let's
I've
get other
given you
people in the
examples.
conversation.
I've given examples. I'll give you a few more. But I know one is not to disparage a movement and to misunderstand the politics and the history, and to certainly, really in a certain way, belittle the depths of black suffering. Yes, all human beings are equal in the eyes of God, but on the eyes of the United States government, it's not a failed state. Actually, for black people, it's an accurate articulation of the desire of the state. You do not produce 400 years of an outcome and say to the biggest capitalist state in the world in human history, we don't know how we did this, it's just a mistake. It's not a failure, it's an intentional practice.
Let's get a couple other people.
Can I get a little bit of this action? So.
I told y'all I wasn't gonna talk. I was trying to help you.
No, I didn't mean entire
Yeah,
time.
no,
Just,
feel
I'm
free.
inspired by the intensity of it all. Spent too much time behind my
haven't
desk.
seen anything.
In any case, so I'm a little bit where Tricia left off because I feel like the provocation of Mike Brown is an unnecessary point in the way that Tricia has mostly articulated. And I want even the audience to kind of, by a show of hands, feel like the exoneration of Darren Wilson vis-a-vis the facts of what the Department of Justice found in the investigation of Mike Brown means that this movement, however we might define it in terms of Black Lives Matter, et cetera, is ineffective. So maybe just a straw poll of the audience. Do you think that because of Mike Brown not living up to the hands up, don't shoot tropes and organizing delegitimizes the larger problem of police violence? I mean, Glenn has categorically said it cannot be defined as state violence because he has an idea of what state violence is, and it doesn't look like Tamir Rice or other instances. But are you willing to go along with that? Because it would help me know when and where to intervene, because I feel like we're going to keep getting stuck at these extremes of whether Mike Brown deserves to be a focal point or not a focal point. So are you going to play along? By a show of hands, does it matter that Mike Brown was not innocent on that day by the definition of the legal standards that made legitimate the shooting of him? By a show of hands, does it change anything for you?
No.
Okay. So let's put that aside. Let's move on from Mike Brown, because I don't think we get very far if we keep staying there. I want to deal with what will move the needle, because I think that Glenn's making a couple of points. One, about what kind of history, what are the grounds upon which history shapes and informs this. He talks about the Black freedom movement in his piece, and it's in the reply, and he has very strong language here. He says, I object to using Brown's death as the occasion to mount a movement on behalf of racial justice precisely because his death was not a racial injustice. He talks about Brown as not being an Emmett Till. I guess we've heard these things before, so I think I'm getting stuck back with Mike Brown because he's put so much of the force of our convening here on that. I want to make a couple of claims. I want to say, one, that policing will not save us. So no future encounter between another police officer and an unarmed Black person, man or woman, should define the limits of what we imagine should happen going forward. Policing will not save us, Glenn. No amount of police reform, no amount of leadership change, no amount of analysis that says police officers have legitimate fear going into quote-unquote high-crime areas, and how should we strip them of that implicit bias, whether it should be body cameras, that is not going to get us very far down the road. And partly I will argue that there is a history that helps us to see that very clearly. For over 100 years, we've been having a conversation about what kind of policing Black people have been subject to, and subject to the best tools of social science to both document the facts on the ground and to make normative claims about how to address them. I'll quote from one report in 1935 just because it's so resonant, and it suggests to me that if we keep getting stuck about what we should do with policing, we're going to miss the forest for the trees. So in 1935, one of the leading sociologists of the country, a man named E. Franklin Frazier, looked at a police encounter that produced an uprising in that community, not unlike Ferguson, which was it was defined as the first property uprising in a Black community where the spark was a police action. Turns out that a 16-year-old had been caught shoplifting. There was a rumor that he'd been shot by a white cop. He was Afro-Puerto Rican in Harlem. Rumor turned out not to be true. Nevertheless, Harlem went up in flames. Mayor LaGuardia and Adam Clayton Powell, Jr., the future congressman, are riding through town. He was then the Abyssinian pastor, through Harlem with a bullhorn, go back in your homes, this is our community. It looks a lot like it. But out of that came a riot report, and here are just a couple of the recommendations. The police of Harlem show too little regard for human rights and constantly violate Blacks' fundamental rights as citizens. Police aggressions and brutalities more than any other factor weld the people together for mass action against those responsible for their ills. And the third, it is clearly the responsibility of the police to act in such a way as to win the confidence of the citizens of Harlem and to prove themselves the guardians of the rights and safety of the community rather than its enemies and its oppressors. Now, I would submit to you, Glenn, that if we were focused more on this history than what Rosa Parks happened to do 50 years ago, we'd be better able to discern the limits of the problem of policing as a solution. Because what happened to the Harlem Riot Report in 1935? The mayor buried it. Why did the mayor bury it? Because he wasn't going to make the kind of systemic change that was necessary, and he certainly didn't want to get Black folk all riled up, the kind of folk that Tricia is not only expressing in her own response, but also articulating their points of view here today in terms of movement organizing around these issues. So he buried it. The mayor buried it. And it took other Black people, including Black journalists, to expose the report, and now it is here for us for history. So I'm going to use that intervention to make a general claim that we can't solve this problem through better kinds of policing. And we have to draw upon historical precedents that would suggest to us that the problem is a problem of political will in response to anti-racist organizing of the kind that Tricia described. I'll stop there.
I know, I want to hear from others too, but let me just very quickly, I don't know what it was that I said about state failure that gave the impression that I thought it was unintentional. I mean, I could be here all day long talking about the 20th century as one example after another of public policies that were designed to reduce the externalities of capitalism that Blacks were excluded from, starting with Social Security and the GI Bill and Medicare, Medicaid, and everything else. So, I mean, that's very much a story of institutional and structural racism from the top down. That for housing policy, I mean, I'm not kidding when I say it could be be here all day talking about that. So if I conveyed that, I apologize. That wasn't at all my intent. And secondarily, I absolutely agree with you, Khalil, 100% about this is sort of my point, that the fixation on policing, I think, is problematic from the perspective of trying to ameliorate these much larger inequalities we're dealing with. And I'm not sure exactly why you looked at me when you said, people. Okay. Well, when you said about legitimate, police may have legitimate, whether police have legitimate fear going into high crime neighborhoods. Again, I'm with you 100%. It doesn't change the fact that policing, that what we require of police in a democratic society is that they be fair and just, and not shoot, people to the extent that they are. I would also say, last thing, I think anytime the police shoot somebody, it's state violence. I mean, we may decide it was the right thing to do, but when the police shoot people, it's state violence. When we imprison people, it's state violence. We have accepted that that's part of what we do in a democratic society. We let the state do things that we don't think we should do. But I think anytime they shoot, regardless of what the person's doing, it's an act of state violence.
Okay, let's collect some more questions. Andre.
Yeah, quickly. My name is Andre Willis. I teach in the Religious Studies Department. My question for you, I think, two parts, Professor Miller. One, I'm wondering what conception, what theory of citizenship your presentation is sort of relying on. It seems to me what kind of presupposes that citizenship is just a birth certificate or a piece of paper that's marked citizen, when Margaret Summers and T.H. Marshall and others suggest that citizenship is about recognition, a membership in a community and being recognized as a moral equal, right? And so your focus then on what you call state failure instead of police seems to subvert the question. So if the question is, are they moral equals, that is, do the police look at these people as moral equivalents as they're looking at other folks, that question gets missed by your work, it seems to me.
Okay, good question.
And then second, real quick, saying to you again, you show in your data that white women have like 700% less chance of being victimized by homicide, however you put that, right? So gently. My question then is, why do you think we hear about them so much in the media? Given this 800% or 7%.
Right. Well, I think that, the answer to the second part is the easy one, which is white racism. And actually, your book speaks to this brilliantly. The long history of equating blackness with criminality. So I will maybe, if I can, defer more on that, because I think that's there's a lot of research on that, but it's very clear that there's a lot of assumptions about black criminality, especially when it comes to white victims and white womanhood. But the other question is a good one. I guess I would say I don't think of it as a theory of citizenship. I think of it as a theory of the state, and that the two primary obligations, so the foundational obligations, if a state can't do these two things, can't protect citizens from violence, from fellow citizens, or are using a heavy-handed state violence, then we can characterize them as a kind of limited state failure, or sometimes entirely state failure. And so by linking those two things together, I think what I'm trying to do is to illustrate the lack of recognition for Black Americans as moral and politically, economic, social, moral equals, right? That the fact that they don't enjoy those protections is illustrative of how we think about citizenship, or how we've constructed citizenship, I guess I would say, in the United States. And so by casting it as racialized state failure, it highlights that the fundamental promise of the state, which we've been refining for since Thomas Hobbes, has largely been we've failed to provide to Black Americans in the way we do for white Americans. And so I think about I think you're right. I think the police do think differently about the moral. I don't think they think of African Americans as the moral equivalent in many of those contexts. I don't, and I don't think that's. But like Khalil said, I don't think singling that out is going to resolve those problems.
Let's bring in others. Yeah. And I'm going to collect some questions before turning it back to
science here. A conceptual question: how would the theory of structural racism handle the election of an African American as president of the United States of America? Just a conceptual question.
Okay, let's collect some more. Go ahead.
Frederick Ryan, senior political scientist. We all know that cases such as Mike Brown aren't uncommon. So I was wondering, how confident are each of you in the solutions that you propose to these issues?
Okay. Other questions? Yes.
I have another question for Lisa.
If you can introduce yourself, please.
I'm Nausicaa, runner. I work at Boston Review, for full disclosure. I'm curious about the idea of like exposure as something that the state does or like allows. It seems like kind of a euphemistic term almost, and I kind of wanted you to answer Patricia's question earlier about what the state can do, because it seems like a lot of the evidence that you present is often used to rally encouragement for more policing.
Right.
Like you see, Black communities with a lot of crime. It's like, okay, like let's police them. So, what from the state failure perspective are the solutions?
Okay, great. Yes.
I'm Sean Connor. I have no affiliation with Brown except that I accept their generosity to me as a member of the community. I'd like the panelists to speak about voting and whether voting might be as difficult as it is, whether voting might be a solution to this problem. That's a question of, do you believe in the power of politics to make changes?
Good, Christine.
Hello, my name is Antonio Milok. I'm visiting from Hampton University. My question is mostly an economic question. With rent being the #1 driver of the labor market in these low-income communities, how can we change it so that they can have more access to the commodities market, which they seem to have interest in in these communities? If they're not, if their interaction with the white community, other than policing, is the day-to-day interactions they have in commerce or trading or purchasing things in stores, and that's really their view of the white community as being owners of the commodity market. How can we get them to participate in that market by giving them more access, by bringing down something like rent, so that they can have more participation in property?
You said bringing down something like
Rent.
Rent.
oh, rent.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it seems simple, but it's a great piece of their economic pie.
Great.
Those sorts of things.
We have one last question back there.
My question is to...
If you could identify yourself, please.
My name is Jabbar Mustafa. I am a Brown alumni. My question is to Professor Miller. I was struck by the graph comparing Canada and United States. And I was wondering if we can use this term for state failure. Is it reasonable to associate this, the gun culture in this country and the policy as a state failure? Do you think it's reasonable characterization to say that the violence in this country because of the gun culture and...
Oh, that's
Great. So I think we have a lot of questions on the floor, so who wants to answer?
Can I take a stab at something that I think?
And let's try to keep the answers relatively brief.
Quickly. So I want to ask Lisa and Tricia to respond to what I'm about to say, because I think they see things differently. So Lisa proposes a state failure, and we're getting a lot of questions about it, is something we need to correct, resolve, fix. Tricia's saying it's intentional, and therefore the system is working as it wasn't built to do. And in that regard, I think Tricia is more right than Lisa, and I think it's helpful because the liberal frame that race is an aberration, is the exception to the rule, is the thing that we keep working on. And the president himself, to maybe roll in your question a little bit, has absolutely evoked the idea that any evidence of racism is a legacy, a vestige, an artifact of some bygone era, that essentially I, as the president, represent that legacy can't exist. I cannot be in this position, I cannot inhabit this space, and that legacy be something that is real and contemporary. So I want to just confirm that Tricia, in fact, does see this as intentional. I want to say that history teaches me that it has been intentional. Also, to the question of economics, not only does the second Ferguson report talk about, and something I think is far more problematic for us, is that the public sphere has begun to commodify black bodies in a way that much of our history was about the private sphere, the marketplace commodifying black bodies through, of course, slavery first, and then through elaborate economic repression known as sharecropping or even Fordism. There really is no moment to disentangle from our history in this country, from slavery to the present, where black folks weren't commodified in the name of capitalism for the purpose of accruing profit, which is to say the system is doing exactly what it was intended to do. But it makes us sleep better at night. We can teach our children stories that are uplifting and inspiring to tell them that the democratic project allows for an ever expansion of participation in the system. And I think the problem, to close, is that we've reached the limits of the idea of assimilation as the thing that will save us, which I think is where Danielle Allen positioned the debate, which is to say we can no longer imagine that if we had a black president, if we had a black Supreme Court justice, if there were just enough rich black people, that the system would correct and be inclusive. That no longer exists. So we're stuck now with imagining something that we've been afraid to imagine, is that the whole damn system is fundamentally built to do what it has been doing, and unless we reorganize the system, it's not going to change.
Can I start first? I mean, let me say I'm going to continue to resist the effort to see this as a contradiction. I mean, I see what I'm calling racialized state failure as very much a function of all these deliberate efforts. And I don't think it's a contradiction to say that maybe because the system is doing what it was designed to do, it necessarily means that we can, I guess I'm not saying there's necessarily anything we can do about it. I mean, the grim reality, to the answer to some of the questions about what to do, is that in my view, there's an institutional bias, which has existed since day one, which has allowed a vocal and virulent and hateful white majority, and now perhaps white minority, I don't know, but to block any effort at progress for black Americans. And that's true for in all kinds of ways that we could talk about later. So I'm not optimistic. Having said that, I guess I would add that, I don't want to sound banal, but, there are things that make a difference. I mean, getting those ridiculous, recalcitrant former Confederate states to expand Medicaid would do a lot for a lot of people. Right, but that's a function of our federal system, right, that allows that to happen. So there are minimum wage, increase the minimum wage will do a lot for a lot of people. Unfortunately, because of the long history of bias, black Americans are starting from such a different position that I think it has to be racial. The conversation has to be racial, because it's not as though we're all. It's not as if poor whites and poor African Americans or people who are suffering in disadvantaged white communities are suffering from the same things. They're not, and there's enormous evidence that the worst conditions for white urban dwellers is about average conditions for black urban dwellers. So I think the conversation has to be racial. How successful we are with that, I think, I guess Khalil, as Khalil would say, history has kind of told us.
Let's go to Tricia and then give Glenn the last word.
Okay, so very quickly, I think it's the word failure that gives the impression that what you're claiming is that on the case of race, the state fails, but it's otherwise successful. And if in fact the state is successful in its racial project, then it's not failure. It's not that we disagree about the content, but it's about actually what we understand the state to be doing and what we understand the state to be. But let me just quickly, I think this gentleman, I forgot your name. You said Ashwar. I quip at public lectures this, but I mean it. I guess in this sense I'll share a strategy that Glenn has used here, but to say that if I were a right-winger, I would have elected a black president a long time ago, given what I found out during these 8 years. That is to say, you can have a black leader and keep the whole system in place and actually galvanize white hostility, get them to vote out of their own class interests, but for their racial interests, with a black president who's hamstrung by this majority of political context. I'm like, why didn't I think of that? It's genius. Now, that requires a particular type of understanding about the subtlety and complexity of the way racial ideology works. It can't just be hatred versus inclusion. This is not a prejudice issue. It is a power issue, and it's an identity issue and an identification issue. It's how whiteness works as an invisible structuring force that produces immense privileges while people think they're constantly earning things that they did not earn. There's incredible research on this. It's just really obvious. I mean, once you've read it all, you're like, okay, there's no debate about this. Why can't we get people to pay attention? So part of it is the way racial ideology works. So there has to be a conversation about ideology to fix this. So that's how the election of a black president doesn't interrupt it. I just want to say a couple solutions. One is fully enforce and punish anti-discrimination law. That is to say, there's anti-discrimination, stop, we've gutted it, and we claim we're doing it. So we want solutions, we can just, there's some basic things we can do. We can actually stop providing incentives that reinforce the racial wealth gap. We can respond to these so-called high crime areas in ways that have to do with improving the overall conditions, which means very specifically turning black unemployment rates, which are quadruple what are considered a crisis in mainstream society, and understand them as catastrophic. There should be a lot, fire departments should be leaving the firehouse constantly based on this. 19-20% during the recession, you had a black unemployment rate. 40% for young black men between 18 and 24. Of course they're the ones killing each other. They're completely broke, and it's not just poverty, it's racialized poverty in these interlocking ways. So there's a lot that can be done, but political will requires an anti-racist consciousness, and an anti-racist consciousness means unpacking structural racism in every way that we can. That's how you build a community. To me, there's great hope. It's just, it's not gonna be a fairy tale. No, I'm just saying, I'm hopeful.
Right.
I'm bizarre. I'm quite hopeful, but not by living in a fantasy.
And Glenn, we've come to the end of the session.
So I won't try to say very much here. Tricia, I don't think it's correct that.
To just argue with me.
No, I'm gonna say more than that, but I wanted to make this, I wanted to make this point forward. Stop and frisk in New York City was indeed changed by that election. The federal court that you cited, that order was stayed by a higher court. I don't know if the de Blasio administration is still appealing the finding, but in any case, a federal judge's decision is not the product of a movement, it's the product of legal advocacy. But the main thing I want to say here is there's nothing wrong with capitalism, and inclusion is the answer. Capitalism has its flaws, but there ain't nothing wrong with capitalism. The United States is a rich, prosperous country that could afford a great deal more opportunity to its citizens, its poor and marginal citizens, than it does. And one of the reasons for that is the success of capitalism. You cite the unemployment rates, Tricia, and you talk about the marginalization of African American people, Khalil. Well, employment for these young men means including them within the capitalist engine. Yeah, there should be a minimum wage. Yeah, there should be health care. Yeah, there should be supports for people. Yeah, we need to fix the schools and spend more money on the education of people who are disadvantaged in order that they be equipped to enter into and participate in the wealth-generating engine, which is the American capitalist order. Reform, social policy is one thing, but striking at the core of the capitalist order, I think, it's a mistake, and I don't see that it's worked any place.
Unfortunately, we've come to the end of our time for this session, although there is a reception afterwards, and I welcome you all to continue the conversation there. But please join me in thanking our wonderful panelists.